countries around the world are reacting to this, we're going to see a major rise in and strengthening of nationalism. One aspect of this undoubtedly will be cultural nationalism. What I mean by that is, I think that we're going to see quite a significant pullback from contact with other parts of the world. Now, one of the reasons for this, and I think one of the most dramatic immediate results of the pandemic, is going to be a significant reduction in long distance travel. The reason for this is quite simple. What several countries have managed to do, particularly in East Asia, but also some other places like New Zealand, is to basically completely control the spread of the virus through a combination of social distancing measures and very extensive testing and tracking of people who've contracted the virus. Now, that's well and good, but the problem is that the virus is still out there and pretty much out of control in many other parts of the world. Now, what that means is if you want to stay where you have got to in New Zealand or Taiwan or South Korea, you're going to have to block most inbound travel. And you're going to have to do so until a vaccine is available to control the virus, or the virus mutates into a much milder and less dangerous form. And either of those is going to take about 18 months to 2 years. So what that means is that for the next 2 years, probably, you can expect to see major restrictions on long distance travel. I think most countries are going to either ban it completely, or more likely, they will insist that anyone coming to their shores has to undergo 2 weeks quarantine. Now, what that means is that most business travel, along with tourism, is basically just going to stop. And I think a lot of the controls that are put in place during this period are going to persist. And this will have all kinds of very far-reaching effects. And one of them, I think, is going to be a significant decline in cultural interconnectivity and a rise of a sense of nationalism or of national particularity. There's also quite obviously going to be economic nationalism. And this is something that was well underway before the crisis began, with the policies of Donald Trump and with the effective paralysis of the World Trade Organization's dispute resolution chamber. So we're going to see a move towards protectionism. Not only that, but also one of the things that the pandemic has revealed is how vulnerable and fragile many just-in-time and single-source long-distance supply chains are. And this, I think, is going to lead to a reassessment of this. So a lot of people are going to move away from long-distance supply chains. They're going to accept the need for much more redundancy in the economic system than we've had recently. And this means a lot less transnational economic integration. And of course, what this will all go along with is a rise in political nationalism. Again, something that we could see happening very much before the crisis broke, for which I think will get an enormous push from it. The other side of this is the second consequence I expect, which is, as it says here at the top, a crisis of the rules-based international order. The flip side, if you like, of a resurgence in the power and legitimacy of national governments is going to be a significant decline in the effectiveness and even the existence, maybe in some cases, of supranational orders. And the whole international order, which has been gradually built up since 1944 and the Bretton Woods Conference, and particularly since 1990, a whole network of treaties and international rules that have basically provided the structure for the world economy, this is going to come under very, very severe threat. It was already in an increasingly weak state before the crisis happened, again because of the policies of the Trump administration, but also because of the continuing problems in the EU, the crisis in the World Trade Organization with the collapse of its dispute resolution procedure, and growing pressure generally on the international order from subaltern powers. And two of the things I think are going to happen are, first of all, that the EU is going to face probably its greatest ever crisis, bigger even than the financial crisis of 2008. it quite literally has not covered itself in glory in this current crisis. Right now, as you probably know, the finance ministers of the Eurozone are having crisis meetings to try and deal with the problems of the economic impact of the virus and the shutdowns on the southern tier of the EU. And this is so far not seeing any kind of resolution. If Italy were to leave the Eurozone, or even in extremis the EU, it's hard to see how the institution can survive. On the other hand, it's hard to see how any German government can survive the kind of measures that would have to be taken in order to address the issues being raised by countries like Italy, or for that matter, Spain. And what I think in terms of geopolitics is going to happen from this is that the United States, and also the EU, are going to be relatively weaker. The United States, again, has not covered itself in glory in this current crisis. Its handling of the epidemic has been conspicuously less deft and effective, shall we say, than that of many other countries. It currently has by far the worst trajectory or projected trajectory for the spread and impact of the illness. What this is going to do, of course, is to boost these so-called subaltern or rising powers, which are the ones I've listed here, China and Russia in particular, but also to some degree India, although India has problems of its own with the pandemic. It's worth saying, by the way, there are a number of other countries that are in really serious trouble. One of them is Iran, which has again completely mishandled the epidemic. It's quite unpredictable what is going to happen in the politics there. Third big thing is that we're going to see a major economic crisis. This has been brewing for a while. It's been obvious for quite some time that we were on the verge of a major financial crisis. All kinds of people from across the political spectrum have been warning about this. It's a bit like going through the Alps and seeing a huge accumulation of snow hanging at the top of a mountain. You know that there is going to be an avalanche. What you can't say is exactly when the avalanche will happen or what precise event will set it off, but you can be pretty sure that it's going to happen. It's the same with the state of the world financial system. Now, it's worth explaining exactly what has happened here, because this is not a demand side shock. In other words, what we've not had here is a shock to confidence and demand, which has then fed into a lack of demand for products, which has then hit the supply side. Rather, what has happened is that the supply side has taken a massive hit. Now, historically with pandemics, the hit to the supply side is caused by things like an awful lot of people dying or maybe a major famine. In this case, it's deliberately induced. Governments have deliberately brought about a massive supply side shock in order to try and control the spread of the virus. So basically, huge chunks of the economy have been shut down. Now, the figures for this are quite striking. We are looking at falls of about 10% plus to GDP within just 1 quarter. That's absolutely catastrophic. The question, of course, is what will happen afterwards? Now, the purpose of many of the measures that governments have taken are to preserve the supply side of the economy, so that hopefully, once we get out on the other side of the epidemic, there will be a very sharp rebound, because if the supply side of the economy is kept going on life support in a kind of deliberately induced coma, if you want to use that metaphor, then once the crisis is over, you would expect to see those supply side indicators and firms react very quickly and you get a very fast rebound. The problem is that this whole crisis is going to be prolonged. Even if it's not as acute as it is at the moment, we can't see it realistically ending in less than 18 months. There isn't going to be an effective vaccine available sooner than that. The virus is not going to mutate into a milder form before then either. Moreover, there are 2 possible scenarios ahead of us. One is that the virus goes away during the summer, but we then get a second wave, which would probably be more widespread and more damaging than the first wave, which we're currently in the autumn, in November and December. That's the common pattern with pandemics historically, by the way. On the other hand, it could be that this virus doesn't have seasonal variation. We don't know yet. If that's the case, it is going to persist throughout the summer, throughout the autumn and into the spring. what we will have to do is to keep a significant amount of controls in place in order to prevent a sudden upsurge in the virus at any one point. And that's going to have a continuing depressive effect on the supply side of the economy. Now, what that's going to do, of course, is to massively depress investment, because nobody's going to invest until they know that the health crisis is resolved. But also, of course, it will cause enormous problems in terms of the solvency and cash flow of a huge part of the economy. Now, the reason why that's particularly problematic is that because largely of the deranged monetary policy that we've been pursuing really since the end of the 1990s, and certainly since 2008, there is an enormous problem of global debt. And there are large amounts of debt out there that are fundamentally unsound. Two obvious examples, both of which could blow up the financial system later on in the year, are car purchase and leasing debt, which amounts to $1.4 trillion in the United States, and shale oil paper, again, mainly found in the United States, which amounts to, again, just short of $1 trillion. Both of these forms of debt are currently highly valued, but I think will prove to be almost worthless by the end of the year. And so you're either going to have a disorderly number of debt defaults, which will put enormous strain upon the financial sector, or you will have to have widespread and radical debt forgiveness as a measure of government policy, which again will have enormous implications for the financial sector. And so we're looking at an extremely cloudy economic situation for about 2 years. I think after that, the economy will recover, and it will recover quite rapidly, but it will have had a permanent effect, of course. All sorts of sectors will have taken a permanent hit. Conversely, other sectors will have done very well and will actually have emerged. New things will have emerged, but it's very hard at the moment to see exactly what is happening. Now, the political change is the fourth thing I expect to see happening. Some of you may know that I have a theory that most Western countries, most developed countries, and quite a few developing ones, are going through a political realignment, a change in the major issue that societies are divided over, away from economics and towards culture and identity. And I think this is going to be accelerated and pushed even further by the current crisis. The major aspect of this is a transformation of the centre-right. We can already see this happening with the Conservative Party, and we can see it happening, I think, with other centre-right parties. They are moving away at a terrific rate from economic liberalism towards a different kind of centre-right politics, more like Bismarckian conservatism in many ways, a kind of conservatism that combines traditionalism, quite a fair degree of authoritarianism and nationalism, with significant economic interventionism. And this, again, is a trend that was well underway before the crisis began. In the case of the British Conservative Party, you can trace it back certainly to 2017, I would argue even before then. The left, even more than at present, will be pulled in two directions between its traditional working class base on the one hand, which will be very fed up with a lot of the kind of politics that the left has been pursuing after this crisis is over, and on the other hand, its younger metropolitan wing, which will want to reassert things like globalism, which the crisis will have called into question. So there is going to be a lot of huge internal rows on the left, if you will, and what I think this will lead to is a definitive parting of the ways, and a certain part of the left is probably going to end up in alliance with the newly transformed right, actually. Now, in about 2 years, I do think a liberal alternative is going to clearly come together, because what will happen is that we will be in a world which in some ways is less friendly to liberalism and the idea of liberty, because it will be dominated by explicitly anti-liberal forms of politics. But on the other hand, that makes it much clearer who the liberals are, where they stand, what it is that they believe in. So that will lead to a much clearer definition of an actual liberal force in politics. What you will also get, however, is undoubtedly a big upsurge in populism. And quite a few of these populists are going to claim to be liberals of a nationalist type. False prophets is what I would say they are. What I think we're also going to see is this. We're going to see new thinking about governance of the state. And I predict that both economically and in terms of practical policy, the model is going to be East Asian states, not least because they will be seen to have handled this crisis much, much more effectively than Western governments have. Now, the model which is going to be followed, fortunately, is not that of China. I think there is actually a widespread feeling around at the moment that the Chinese handling of this has been heavy-handed, not very effective, and also that the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government have been lying through their teeth significantly during the whole of this period. And this has not put them in good odor. On the other hand, I think Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, and even Japan are all going to be seen much more as models of how to construct and organize the state and public policy. Now, what that means in terms of the future direction of politics in many countries, I think, is a government that is much more active, does a lot more things than we are perhaps used to in the West at the moment, but very often a government that actually is smaller in terms of the share of GDP that it takes. That is indeed the Far East model. If you look at countries like Singapore or Taiwan, the government takes a smaller share of GDP in terms of spending than most European countries do, but it also does a lot of things that governments in Europe don't do. In the Anglo-Saxon countries, not so much elsewhere, I think there are going to be major welfare reforms. I think that one of the things this crisis has done is to bring to a head the growing discontent with the dysfunctional and in personal terms actually rather cruel welfare system that the Anglo-Saxon countries have adopted, one built around means-tested income transfers. I think that the actual practical administration of this has finally been found totally wanting. And what we're going to see is a move quite sharply away from that. What direction that move will be in is much less predictable. It might be in the direction of universal basic income, but actually I would tend to bet against that. It might well rather be in the direction of either more social insurance or something like a universal basic services model. But that's one of the areas that's going to be up for grabs. What I think is definitely the case is that the current welfare system is not going to survive much longer. There's going to be a revival of state ownership and production. So I think that the idea that the state should own key assets and major services is going to get a huge boost. But I think we're also going to see a big decline in regulation. Because what is going on at the moment is that all kinds of regulations are being suspended because of the crisis. And the response of many people to these announcements is, wait a minute, I didn't even know we had that regulation. And in any case, why on earth do we have it in the first place? And I think a lot of these regulations are simply going to go away. So I'm quite hopeful, for example, about things like a decline in the licensing of occupations in the United States. I'm quite confident that I think a lot of medical regulation by regulatory and licensing bodies is going to be a victim, fortunately, of this current crisis. And then there's what you might call the intellectual and cultural effects of a pandemic like this. And as I've said before in another forum, I think what you're going to see, and this is what we've always seen after major pandemics in the past, is a combination of, on the one hand, a move to seriousness, and on the other hand, a move towards living for the day and living for pleasure. Very often you actually get the both reactions in the same person. That's a reflection of human nature. But I think we're going to see both of these. On the one hand, people think, gosh, this has made me realize that life is a serious matter. And on the other hand, you will have people thinking, good Lord, this has made me realize I shouldn't hesitate, I should do what I want and live for the day. What this means, I think, is that some intellectual trends are simply going to stop. A lot of intellectual frivolity in the academy and elsewhere is going to suddenly end. I think that a lot of the identity politics that was obsessing so many people in the years before the COVID-19 virus made its debut are going to suddenly vanish, because people just regard this as basically incredibly self-indulgent. Hopefully this will lead to a demise of things like postmodernism and critical theory in the academy, and a lot of the rather incredibly fine points of difference in analytical philosophy and the like. On the other hand, you shouldn't believe that all the intellectual trends that maybe you don't like or disagree with are going to stop. That's the kind of dangerous thinking I warned against at the start. And in particular, I think that environmentalism, and quite radical environmentalism, and thinking about climate change is actually going to get a big boost from this. So I expect that something that was already growing as a force before the pandemic is again going to get another boost from it. So that's one of the areas of intellectual activity I think that will actually do it. What you are going to get is some serious thinking in political philosophy, mainly because of the way in which this crisis has boosted the realignment. It means that a lot of new categories are going to emerge, in the sense that people will come to the conclusion that a lot of the traditional way of thinking about political disagreements and divisions is no longer useful, and you need to think about it in a different way. Something very similar happened during and just after World War II and during just after World War I. These kinds of major events do tend to shake up people's understanding of what the really big divisions in society are. Now, wrapping up now, for liberals of all kinds, but particularly classical liberals, what does this mean? Well, first of all, I'm going to say something rather controversial here, perhaps. I think that there's a kind of sorting out of classical liberals been going on for quite a few years now, in which an alarming number of classical liberals are revealing themselves to actually have sympathies or attitudes which mean that they're not truly liberal. They're actually more anti-leftist, which is not the same thing. And in this particular context, discussion of the coronavirus and the epidemic, it's quite clear that there's too many people in the classical liberal camp who have abandoned the reality-based community and entered the cultic milieu. That's the cultic subworld of cranky and strange ideas like flat earth theory, Atlantis, flying saucers and the like. They've jumped the shark, if you will. It's one thing to think that you need to think about trade-offs in your response to a major public health emergency of this kind. It's quite another thing to actually fly in the face of all kinds of medical and scientific evidence and to engage in all kinds of crazy and bonkers conspiracy theories, which way too many people have done. And so I think what we're going to see is a sort of wrapping up, in fact, of the sorting out of the classical liberal movement between what I might call serious people and people who are either not serious or who have sympathies and actual beliefs which in many senses are not liberal at all. They may be opposed to the state or the contemporary state, but they have other attitudes and beliefs that don't conform to liberalism at all. I think there is quite clearly now something which I've been, again, thinking for a while. There's a need to rethink liberalism generally and the whole liberal project, because essentially we are all living in the final stages, I think, of a liberal project that was begun by people ranging from Keynes at one end of the spectrum to Hayek at the other, if you will, during the latter part of World War II, around 1944, when Keynes went to Bretton Woods and Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom. And this was a project, if you like, of building or creating a particular kind of economic and political and international order out of the devastation of the central decades of the 20th century. And I think that that project has quite clearly now run its course. And I think that essentially, when historians do come to write about the current moment, they're going to see the pandemic of 1920, 1921 as being the point where that era of history that began up there in New Hampshire finally came to an end. And we do need to think about what it means to be a liberal in this new world. One of the things to realize is that because of the new world of politics I've quickly sketched out, liberals of all kinds need to give up the idea that they are centrist or moderate in any way, because liberalism of any kind is now going to be one of the extremes of the new politics. And that will make, in some ways, the job of liberals easier, because it means that it's much more clear what we're standing for and what we are against. But it also means, in many ways, initially, that we will realize that we're rather isolated. And one thing I think which does come from this is that if you are a classical liberal, you need to continue to remain interested in economics and realize how important economics is, but it will become less central to your and our political identity. People in the classical liberal world often define themselves as being free marketeers. They think of their economic views as being what defines their political position. I think that's actually wrong on a number of levels, but one of the things that will become clear, I think, in the new emerging world that we're now being pushed into at an ever more rapid rate by the pandemic, is that that is not the core value. It's a secondary consequential feature of the package, which derives from the underlying real value, which is an emphasis upon personal liberty and autonomy. In other words, it's not that you believe in personal liberty and autonomy because you're a fan of capitalism. It should rather be that you're a fan of capitalism and the free market because you believe in personal liberty and autonomy. And I think what we're going to see is the development of a kind of politics and argument which will focus more on a number of other things rather than just purely economics. I would add, by the way, also that I think one of the things that does emerge from crises like this is that you can't always make straightforward economic efficiency your main and sole goal, because very often you do have to exchange a bit of economic efficiency for other things such as redundancy and resilience in particular. And what I think has become very clear from this crisis is that quite a lot of the economic institutions that we have and economic systems that we have are very productive and very efficient, but they're also extremely brittle and fragile. They're not resilient, much less anti-fragile, to borrow a term from, of course, Nassim Nicholas Taleb. And finally, last slide here, we need to get ready, because there's going to be an enormous argument or reckoning in about 2 years' time. For the rest of this year and most of next year, we are still going to be in the crisis of a global pandemic. In about 2 years' time, it will become clear that we've moved out of that the world has passed through this particular historical moment. And at that point, the really big arguments will start. And the arguments will be not only what do we learn from this, but also what kinds of measures taken during the crisis should be kept and made permanent, and which should be made temporary. And that's when you need to get the argument. And it's worth thinking about and going back to what happened between 1946 and 1950. Because in those 4 years, on both sides of the Atlantic, there was an enormous argument over whether or not to keep in place the kind of extensive controls over both the economy, social life, political life, everything, in fact, that had been put in place during the war. And we might think that, well, it was obvious that they weren't going to be kept in place, that people were going to get rid of things like identity cards, price controls and like. Well, not so. There was actually an enormous argument. The US Congress only very narrowly voted to scrap the wartime price and wage controls in 1946. There was a big argument within Britain over rationing, because many people in the Attlee government wanted to keep rationing indefinitely, and also over things like the powers the Ministry of Labour had been given to control and direct people, to tell people what kind of work they would do. Again, quite a few people thought this should be continued as part of the future. And there was an enormous debate, and also in other countries too. Same thing happened in Italy, for example, in France. And the argument was won, if you like, by the pro-liberty side. So a huge amount of what grew up during the war was actually rolled back. And we're going to have a huge argument of that kind in about 2 years' time. So there's a need, as I say here, to have arguments ready for that debate. But also, I think what all of us will have to do is to prioritize, to be quite clear amongst ourselves, or each of us in our own mind, perhaps, what are the areas that we simply will insist on being rolled back, and what are the areas where we might perhaps compromise simply because you can't put in the same amount of effort across the board with all the issues. And that relates to the final point, which is the need for a long-term strategy. And part of that long-term strategy, I think, going forward, will have to be cultural politics, or meta-politics, as it's called, the kind of a focus upon the kinds of areas of life that are currently not thought of as having any kind of political meaning or implications, such as culture, art, music, aesthetics, the nature of the built environment, a whole range of things like that. The nature of the home, the nature of the household, the nature and status of personal relationships of all kind. These are the kind of things which I think we're going to increasingly need to focus on, perhaps at the expense of some other things that we've been concentrating more upon for the last 40 or 50 years. So, final sentence, I think that this is not going to bring about anything new, the crisis we're in. It's going to have huge effects, though. And in particular, what it is going to do is, as I said right at the start, push us much more rapidly and further down a road that we were already travelling on. And unfortunately for Liberals, the direction that events and ideas were taking before the virus appeared was not a good one. And so we have now, I think, to gird ourselves for a serious conflict and to therefore think very hard about how we're going to try and push back against the things that are going to happen in the next 2 years, and also how to then think about what to do in the longer term beyond that. So at that point, I'll go away from the slides and see what questions you have.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Davies, for such an interesting talk. First of all, I'd like to tell you all that you can send us your questions in the questions and answers button that you should find at the bottom of your screen if you're on Zoom. You can also post them in the comment section if you're on Facebook. So first question, Dr. Davies, is from Thomas Walker. And he asks, will countries still quarantine new arrivals even when antibody tests or better testing in general allow you to prove you're safe?
That would actually be the thing that would make it less likely. The reason why I'm pessimistic on this is that, I don't know if you've been reading the reports about this, but currently we have lots of antibody tests out there, but they're not very accurate. They have way too many false positives, but even worse, false negatives. Now, you could live with the false positives, but of course the false negatives are a huge problem. And unfortunately, it's going to take quite a while to develop a really reliable and accurate test. And governments, for obvious reasons, and I think justifiable reasons actually, are going to say, well, look, we really want to err on the side of caution. We do not want to run the slightest risk of starting the epidemic going again. Because the problem with being successful at suppressing the virus in the way that, say, South Korea has done, is that it means your population is nowhere near herd immunity. The bulk of the people in your population have not had the virus, therefore they've not acquired immunity to it. So if, let's say, just one person was to get in who was infected, because this virus has a very high, what's called R0, that's the number of cases that are given rise to by the initial person, the patient zero, it's 2.54 by most estimates, which is very high. It could spread really, really rapidly. If just one person got into New Zealand and wasn't picked up, by the time you realize what was going on, they could have infected an awful lot of people through a cascade effect. So governments, with that in mind, I think, are going to be very reluctant to lift these controls until they can be sure that the antibody tests are really, really accurate. And that's going to take quite a while. And so, sadly, I think that although tests of this kind of very important, we need to test a lot more than we're testing at the moment. It's not going to stop the imposition of a lot of border controls.
Okay, another question is, and this one's particularly interesting, is you said that the modern welfare system will not survive as it stands. Do you see a form of UBI being implemented?
I think there's going to be big suggestions in that regard. Now, let me just qualify that. I think that the Anglo-Saxon country's welfare system is not going to survive. If you look at the world at the moment, there are, broadly speaking, two kind of welfare systems. I mean, these are ideal types. I mean, in reality, in each country, you get a system which is a mixture of both. But broadly speaking, there are two types. One is what you might call the Bismarckian social insurance model of welfare state, which is what you get in most of Europe. The other is the system that has grown up since the 1970s, roughly, which involves large-scale income transfers by the state rather than social insurance. Now, The income transfers take two forms. Some of them are universal. They go to everybody pretty much. The others are means tested. Now, in places like Scandinavia, you tend to get a lot of income transfers rather than social insurance, but they tend to be universal. Now, in the Anglo-Saxon countries, most of these transfers are means tested. Now, that has all kinds of problematic consequences. It creates very bad incentives, but it also makes the administration extremely complicated. So here in the UK, with universal credit, the newly reformed welfare transfer, which the coalition government introduced, it takes 5 to 6 weeks to get it, which is absolutely diabolical, because if you're in need of a major income transfer like that, you probably can't wait for 5 weeks. Particularly in the current context. And so I think what is going to happen is it's the welfare systems of the Anglo-Saxon countries which tend to rely upon means testing to a much greater degree than continental Europe or Scandinavia. They are the ones that are going to come under real pressure. Now, in this context, a lot of people are going to say, look, what we need to do is actually push the logic of our system even further down the universal direction and just get rid of all the existing benefits and have a UBI. There will be a lot of support for this, and I think it will become one of the big political issues. However, I'm not prepared to say that I think it will happen, because there will also be an enormous amount of pushback. And interestingly, the pushback will come from both left and right, because on the one hand, a lot of people on the right don't like it because they think it will undermine personal responsibility, the work incentives, a whole range of things like that. But also a lot of people on the traditional left don't like it because they think it undermines the dignity of work, the whole idea of the working class, and again, that it undermines the role and central social importance of meaningful paid work as part of your identity and your social nature. So you're going to find some surprising alliances both in favour of UBI and against it. And so I think we're going to have a really interesting argument. So we might well move to a UBI. I think at the moment I would say that the chances are slightly worse than even money. So if I was to take a bet with anybody on that, I would say it's about 5 to 4, basically. We might instead move in the direction of something which in some ways is worse, which is universal provision of certain key services, either free of charge or for nominal fees. Universal basic services, as it's called. It's an interesting question.
So Natalia Fuentes asks, what are your thoughts on how emerging market economies will cope with what lies ahead?
Badly, I'm afraid. It's quite striking how the media, for obvious reasons, are really obsessed with what's going on in their own country at the moment. And what has been overlooked in this is what's happening and going to be happening in less developed countries and emerging markets. One thing that's already going on is that there is a massive capital flight out of emerging markets for obvious reasons. Faced with a kind of global crisis of this kind, wealthy people are seeking to move their money into really safe assets such as US Treasury bonds, blue chip stocks in developed countries, real estate in developing countries, things of that sort. So there's huge capital flight out of developing economies at the moment. And this is obviously going to have a very serious effect, particularly if it continues over a longer term. In terms of the virus itself, there was a lot of thought initially that it wasn't going to spread rapidly in hotter countries, but this appears to have been rather sadly not the case. It's now spreading very rapidly in Africa, in places like Latin America, particularly Brazil, but elsewhere as well, and in places like Malaysia. Now, that's really bad news, I'm afraid, because there are, these are countries which do not have as well equipped or well funded health systems as a developed country, but also they have an economy where a very large part of the population depends upon casualized day-to-day work and income, which means that they basically will not be able to impose the kind of quarantines or controls that richer countries have used to try and control the spread. So the spread is going to be much, much harder to contain. And so I'm afraid I have a very gloomy outlook for many parts of the world in the next 6 to 9 months. Things are going to be pretty grim, I'm afraid. without being too alarmist, this is rather like what happened in 1918, 1919. The Spanish flu had a global fatality rate of about 10 to 13%, but that's actually rather misleading, because in places like the United States or Canada or Western Europe, apart from Germany for special reasons, the fatality rate was about 0.5 to 0.7%, which is about roughly where we think COVID-19 is. But what happened, of course, and pushed the global rate up enormously, was that the death rate was much, much higher in the poorer parts of the world, such as Africa and India. And I fear something like that's going to happen this time. I've got a couple of questions here I can see in the chat. Where do I see Australia going is one of them. And do I see the world putting China on trial? Well, maybe the world will put China on trial, but I'm afraid that would just be a waste of time, except for enriching lawyers, because obviously it's a sovereign state like the Chinese state is going to ignore anything like that. I do think the Chinese government, and I would say that, not China. China is, a quarter of the world's population of human beings. The Chinese government is going to be in seriously bad odor with a lot of other governments around the world after this, because what has now emerged is that through a combination of either incompetence or deceit, probably incompetence, they didn't tell people for quite a long time exactly how severe the outbreak was. And internally, for quite a while, they suppressed any discussion of it. And so they let the outbreak become much, much worse than it would otherwise have been. And so a lot of people are going to be justifiably extremely angry with Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. But I think the idea of a trial is just nonsense. That's not going to get anywhere. Sovereign states have a way of avoiding that kind of thing. Australia is currently doing quite well. They have the big advantage of being a long way away from anywhere else. And so they're able to isolate themselves from the rest of the planet fairly readily. They did make a major mistake at the start of the pandemic, two of them. One of them was they allowed a couple of cruise ships, and one cruise ship in particular, to dock in Sydney, which had a large number of cases on board. And that's what really set off the big wave in Sydney. The other thing was they allowed a major gathering of evangelicals to take place, again in New South Wales. And this led to a major spread. By the way, major religious gatherings, along with old people's homes, are one of the two really big, they're the two really big routes for transmission, as far as we can tell. So that was a bad start, but since then they seem to have done quite well. So Australia seems to be handling things pretty well at the moment.
Another question was actually quite a few people are asking this. So you've described implications on, well, the effect this will have on international travel. What do you think will be the impact on this on specifically the Schengen area?
I mean, at the moment, I would say the Schengen area is dead. If you look at what has happened, all of the countries in Europe have imposed border controls. Now, suppose you are in Spain or Italy, and through dint of really severe lockdowns and a lot of deaths, you've managed to get the virus under control. Are you then going to reopen your borders to the rest of the Schengen area? If and only if you are absolutely certain that the other countries have also got it under control to the same degree that you have, and you trust them completely. Now, even if you're the Prime Minister of Spain or Italy, and you do in fact trust the French or the Germans or the East Europeans, do your voters trust them? I doubt it, actually. And lots of politicians, not mentioning names, but people like Signor Salvini, I imagine, would decide that this was a wonderful issue to run on against the government if the government did say it would relax the controls against the rest of Schengen. So I think that for the next 2 years, free movement within the European Union, within the Schengen area, is just not going to revive. And the trouble is, the longer this goes on for, the less likely it is that we'll go back to it.
Another question is, do you see any alternatives for avoiding liquidity collapses other than monetary policy?
Yes, I mentioned one, which is debt forgiveness. The interesting question is this: there is a serious liquidity problem because essentially, well, what we have essentially is a massive problem of cash flow. There are lots of businesses out there who have fixed costs like rents and other things, which they have to keep paying, but they're not selling anything because they've been told to shut down. Or even if they are still going, people just aren't buying the product for various reasons. Now, faced with this, the risk, of course, is that lots of firms which in the longer run are solvent and sound are going to go under because they're going to face an acute cash flow problem. So what governments have done is to take on board and start paying the non-fixed costs of these companies, things like a large part of their wage bill and the like. Now, that's fair enough, but the problem in the longer run is that you need to actually deal with this problem at a more basic level, I think, because the longer we go on, the more acute it becomes. Now, monetary policy is one solution. The problem with that is it stokes up the risk of severe inflation about a year down the line. Currently, broad money in the United States is growing at an annual rate of about 16 to 17%. What that means, that the main indication of that is a huge rise in bank deposits, on-demand deposits. Now, what I think is going to happen is that in about a year's time, as the economy relaxes, that will feed through into a lot of effective demand. The supply side will still be recovering, and it will likely mean a lot of inflation. So that's the problem with using monetary policy. The alternative, the obvious alternative, is quite extensive measures of debt forgiveness, where you basically say, well, okay, those 3 or 4 months of rent that you didn't pay, they're gone. You'll never have to pay them. And so similarly, a lot of corporate and commercial debt would have to be written off, basically, simply because the companies will not have the cash flow to be able to service that debt, much less repay the capital. Now, that has radical implications. It means basically that a lot of creditors are going to be seriously screwed. But I think that probably is what will have to be done by force rather than by conscious policy choice in some cases. And that's the obvious alternative to monetary policy.
So I think we've got time for a final question. And so one of our spectators says, mortality rate of COVID-19 is highly dubious because it is mostly hospitalized people who get tested. Should libertarians argue for an immediate end of lockdowns and argue for self-isolation for vulnerable groups instead?
No. Very straightforwardly, no. It is not the case that the death rate is being overestimated. Actually, it's almost certainly being underestimated. Let's take the British case at the moment. As your questioner rightly says, the figures we're actually getting are the number of people who have presented at hospital and have been tested, and the proportion of them who have died. So the actual deaths that are being read out every day at the press conference are deaths in hospital. Now, if you look at the total daily deaths that are being recorded at the moment, the total daily deaths are way, way more than that. They're about the deaths in hospital of all kinds, not just COVID-19 deaths, only amount to about 20% of total daily deaths. Now, that's not unusual, by the way. That is normal because most people actually don't die in hospital. Most people still die somewhere else. Now, what undoubtedly is happening is that a lot of the deaths outside hospital are actually from COVID-19. Though there are quite a lot of people dying in things like old folks' homes, care homes and the like. There will be people dying at home because they've got the virus. And there's an unknown number of people out there. That's why Nicola Sturgeon has been quite rightly saying regularly in her press conferences that the figures that she's quoting, reading out, are almost certainly a serious underestimate. So when we come to adjust the figures, we will actually find that the death level is higher than it is at the moment. Now, having said that, the big problem is this. We do not have a really firm grasp on what the case fatality rate for COVID-19 is. In other words, what proportion of people who are infected with the virus actually go on to die? And that's because we don't know what the denominator is exactly. We do not know what number of people, what proportion of people in the population it is that have been infected. However, as time goes on, the uncertainty about the size of that denominator is getting less and less, because there's more and more countries where we're having extensive testing, like Ireland, for example, South Korea, New Zealand, Sweden. Until recently, Sweden actually has lost the plot completely in that regard, but a number of places anyway. And what this shows increasingly, I think, is that the death rate for COVID-19 is about 0.6 to 0.7%. Now, that makes it 6 to 7 times more lethal than regular flu. The real problem, though, is that that data also tends to confirm that the proportion of all cases requiring hospital care is over 5%. It's about 5 to 8%, it appears. Now, that's about 5 to 8% for all cases. It's more than 25% for over 70s, and it's a lot less than that for people under, say, 30. The 8% is obviously a global figure. Now, the point is that means that given the kind of figures for infection we're beginning to get an idea of, you're looking at very large numbers of people who require hospital care, and also significant numbers of death. So no, you shouldn't do this. Now, why have these lockdowns? Well, the reason is this. Personally, I think that in the best of all possible worlds, the herd immunity strategy is the right way to go. What you want to do is have moderate social distancing measures so that you spread the infection out over a longer time period, rather than having a very short, intense period when the virus spreads like wildfire with a very high peak. The problem is that even with those kind of measures, the peak you are going to get, although much lower than a pure natural spread, will still overwhelm the health service. It will overwhelm the health facilities of pretty much any country. And that leads to a huge number of deaths from overcrowding, and also people dying from regular things like heart attacks and strokes who can't receive treatment because all the beds in the hospital are taken up with COVID-19 cases. And so I think in many countries, you do have to have things like the lockdowns in place. And in terms of libertarian principle, this is a classic example of an externality. If you go out there and you spread the illness, you're affecting other people very, very severely. And there's a serious collective action problem. Voluntary measures will only work if they're observed by everybody. And the problem here is that that's very hard to do. So there's a serious collective action problem. However, what you do want to do is to make it as short-lived as possible. And also you want to wind it down as soon as you possibly can. That's why the testing is important, to try and work out exactly what proportion of the population are infected, and therefore how close you are to herd immunity, because that's ultimately what you want to get to. But it will take about 12 months, I think, to get to that.
All right, I'm afraid we have to wrap this up here. I'm sorry if I haven't asked your question as much as we'd like to keep answering questions all day. Unfortunately, Zoom has a limit on the amount of time we can stream, so we'll have to close it off here. Thank you, Dr. Davies, again for your time and for a great talk. I'd like to remind everyone that we will have another session next week with Dr. Eamon Butler, as we announced at the beginning. And thank you so much for coming today. Have a lovely rest of the day and see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.